Inside Man is a 2022 4-episode thriller, drama, mystery type TV show from Stephen Moffat, who's been a busy man this year with his The Time Traveller's Wife adaptation coming out earlier in the year. His first play, The Unfriend, also premiered this year. He's exec produced that Amazon show with Peter Capaldi, The Devil's Hour, which is coming out around Halloween. And of course, here we have Inside Man as well, with David Tennant and Stanley Tucci in the leading man roles, and the Moffat regulars Dolly Wells and Lydia West leading as well. They were both, of course, in his Dracula adaptation back in 2020. So, what makes Inside Man special? Its first 2 episodes came out on consecutive days, and next week we'll get the 3rd and the 4th and final episodes to round things off. So, discussing the first half of these first 2 episodes together today will be myself, Neo from Australia, along with my friends from England, Ingiga and Tyler. I don't know about you two guys, but I've got loads of things to say, loads of things to talk about with these first 2 episodes. But let's not delve into spoilers just yet. Let's start off with a more general discussion. I want to ask you guys, how would you describe this show? What is this show exactly? How would you describe it to someone who knew nothing about it?
It's like an open book murder mystery where you know what's happening and you kind of have a good sense of what's going to happen in a very Moffat-y way. And what you're anticipating is not who did it and who's going to do it, but rather the twists and how it's all going to unfold and who's going to figure it out. And I don't know. It's kind of like Sherlock, but it's kind of like Sherlock, but a cheaper BBC production version. That's kind of like Father Brown. Sherlock if Sherlock was Father Brown. That's what it's like.
And that's an interesting way of putting it, given that, the director of this worked on Sherlock, and Hartsford Films does all like the Moffat shows, and obviously Sherlock was BBC as well. So I'm not sure what a cheaper BBC version of Sherlock would how that would be distinct from Sherlock as it already existed. It's sort of the same thing. If you asked me to describe it, I would say, just been toying around with some words in my head, a suspense mystery farce. It's sort of, those vague words just seem to float around this thing. I'm not sure if that really captures the odd sense of humour at play and just the really quite, I guess, sort of unusual structure and choice of subject material, but I think the basic gist of it is there.
Yeah. Tyler earlier saying, it's not like a whodunit, it's more about why it's happening or something. Moffat said that exact thing. He calls it a why-done-it as well.
The other thing, which was always my pitch for this, was I love whodunits.
Yeah.
I do love whodunits. Who doesn't love a whodunit? A great whodunit, and they're all written by Agatha Christie. Who doesn't love the cleverness, the puzzle element, the working it out? But fundamentally, at a dramatic level, whodunit isn't that interesting. Who will do it is.
Exactly.
Why would you do it?
Yeah.
Is.
Totally.
How do you get to the tipping point where you would, I'll do this.
Yeah.
Murdering someone is probably not going to improve your day.
No.
It's a bad strategic and moral choice. Why would you do it? So that became the thing I was interested in.
I think how the different storylines are segmented feels like the appeal to me. I didn't watch the trailers or anything. I only very dimly kept up with the marketing, but I know a big line of that was what connects, someone's in a cellar and then there's a vicar and there's also a crazy American killer or something. How could these things possibly be in a TV show together? So I feel like the separation of the plot lines is part of the novelty as well. That's part of what the elevator pitch for the show. 3 really different things are happening, but they're sort of connected.
Yeah, rather than who done it, there's always an element of who done what, because it's still not clear what exactly this is all leading to. Obviously, we can guess there's a murder involved, and if you're paying really attention, you might even be able to guess who is going to be murdered. But the real question is, what kind of story is this? And that's the usual question with Moffat stuff. The question is how on earth do these things connect, not just literally, physically, but also thematically as well? I think that's kind of the big question, what makes these things all relevant to each other, that they share a story, not just in the literal sense of how do they literally connect across space and time.
But we'll start talking spoilers for the first 2 episodes as well. There's some stuff the show is about, which occurred to me more when I was kind of thinking over it, and there's some stuff the show is really loudly about. I think something the show is really loudly about is what does it take to kill someone? Or how could you get a pretty normal person to kill another normal person, or like the stuff Mary was outright saying in the second episode. Like, how do you actually go about killing someone? That's a big idea of the show, obviously, because Tennant's character is, I find him pretty creepy in a lot of ways, especially as we move on, but he's a pretty normal person. You know, normal can be creepy, but he's a pretty normal guy. So him getting into this, or kind of creating this terrible situation, is kind of, I think, the appeal. Whereas Stanley Tucci's character, who feels more like a killer, you know, he's like in the British interpretation of a big American prison and everything. I think he's more on the sidelines because he's more of a straightforward kind of character in this sort of genre. But Tennant's like, you know, what if everything went wrong for the regular man?
Yeah, I guess the Jefferson Grief, you know, the death row wife killer guy, he exists in this world of almost a Hollywood movie, the killer who's behind bars but delivers sage advice, you know, not necessarily a Hannibal Lecter or anything, but just that sort of almost glamorous world of the famous killer, whereas that is being contrasted with the domestic world of, I guess, like an average guy who you could almost imagine maybe, you know, Jefferson was that kind of average guy before this all happened to him. So it's like the idea that the sort of mystical world of the famous murderer is not actually that far divorced from the world of the mundane and the everyday. It's just a question of like what actually pushes someone into that world. Although I think whenever you have things of, okay, this could happen to any normal person. Oh, this is just a story of a normal random guy. This could happen to anyone. I think that immediately invites scrutiny of just how normal the guy in question actually is. So in Harry's case, I mean, not only is he religious, but he lives in a massive, lovely house. Like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Like, not everyone has circumstances like that. I think what ends up happening is that you notice the aspects of the character situation which aren't necessarily that common, and you start reading into how that or those things might have actually fed into the drama that eventually happens. I think maybe a lot of people would at least tell themselves they would not make the same decisions as Harry in this story, because I think there are some quite interesting decisions he makes, and not necessarily the most normal ones.
With what you were saying about Jefferson Grief, what a name, kind of existing in like a mystical space, I haven't seen any of Moffat's Sherlock, but the way he was like super minding, the text size thing, and, you know, actually she was the killer, and, you know, I can work it all out in my head. To me, that felt like what I've like learnt from osmosis, or like memes of like how Sherlock works. It felt like that kind of TV of like the super genius who, you know, from the tiniest little clue, he can, you know, extrapolate out a whole crazy, super inventive, you know, stream of how a crime worked. Tyler, what did you think of that stuff with Stanley Tucci's character and his crime solving?
Yeah, you mentioned it being like Sherlock, and it is very similar to Sherlock. These mini cases in both episodes, we've had mini subplot cases that aren't really related to the main, you know, the Vicar thing and the Janice thing, but they're kind of like Moffat flexing and the Tucci character the Grief flexing, but they're not very good compared to the ones that we used to see in Sherlock throughout all of the show. Actually, they did some. Obviously, the main episode cases, because Sherlock was about solving crimes, but there were some minor cases as well that were occasionally brought up and sort of spent 10-20 minutes on. They were often very good and quite interesting and quite multifaceted. But these two were really boring, and I really struggled. It kind of got to about 30-40 minutes into both episodes so far, and I kind of go, oh, God. Because it spends sort of 10-15 minutes trying to help the audience, the poor unintelligent audience compared to the genius writer, to understand that. So it kind of, Neo, earlier you mentioned to me that the train thing is explained several times, and it really was. It was explained at least 3 times that I counted. And what was remind me what I've forgotten it already. The mini case from the first episode. What was that one?
That was the pay therapist one.
Oh, the therapist.
Text size.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that one wasn't so bad. It was. Yeah. Okay, I remember now. It wasn't in the middle. The reason that in the middle it dulled was the first conversation that Grief had with Beth, where it was just Grief moralizing a bit and explaining why he is how he is, and I got the point in the first 2 or 3 minutes of it, and for whatever reason, Tucci chose to perform it as the driest, monotonous deadpan. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't get into it. So yeah, I'm relatively disappointed actually so far with a few aspects, Tucci in particular.
I think with both of the mini cases, and the way in which they can be compared to Sherlock, like in both cases, you have Moffat hitting on some small, maybe quirky or silly idea. So the pay therapist one, or in episode 2, the orchestra members wearing a suit one, and he spins the whole case out of that small thing. I think, and it's Moffat's trademark way of, I guess, reverse engineering cleverness on the part of a character, which is like notice some small thing and sort of build a story around it. And that small thing might be very silly or random, or maybe not even make sense. I think you could raise issues with the line spacing thing in the first episode and whether that would actually happen, where exactly it would break the line. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think there is a problem. I agree, Tyler. Like the whole thing in the way in which both of these mini cases are dragged out in such a way, and I think almost a bigger sin, which is that they don't necessarily serve the episode structure in a thematic way. I think if you were watching like a really major, really finely crafted, precise, thematically huge statement from Moffat, you'd have the structure where the side case would be feeding back in to the other storyline, like in some very crystalline way that would become perfectly clear at the climax. So maybe I don't know how exactly that would play out in this case, but rather than the pay therapist thing just being like a gag that's just sort of floating like a loose end in the latter half of the episode, it would somehow parallel or illuminate some issue that's going on with Harry's storyline, for example. I think something almost like that kind of happens in the second episode, where we find out that the woman was just, she just murdered her husband, right? And as Beth is about to learn that, we get that intercut with the whole thing about Harry coming home to Mary and some kind of suspicions going on in their relationship and what might be going on there. So it's maybe a little bit more connected, but nonetheless, like in both cases, it feels like Moffat's sort of playing for time. There's tons of cases where he over-explains stuff over and over.
Yeah. And
even just some regular conversations which seem to go on like several lines longer than they need to. It's really weird. It doesn't feel particularly sharp when it comes to the prison stuff and the case stuff.
Interestingly, I wouldn't call it playing for time. It's more like playing around. It's more like Moffat. This feels like a draft that has sat in Moffat's drawer since COVID, and he's sort of just, he's tweaked it a little bit, and this is what has come out of that, rather than I think if we're talking about Sherlock, which I think is quite pertinent to this conversation, and you mentioned the case that in a more precisely crafted series, these cases would have bled into the main plot, which obviously they should. That's just how TV should work. That's how writing should work.
Yeah, fractally.
So this is just playing. It's just messing around, isn't it? It's just doing some funny, just some fun stuff. So it's a little bit like watching a writer feel around what he can do, rather than crafting something of real interest to the people that actually but the people that actually choose to watch.
All that tracks with how the show actually came about. So, in Moffat's own words, he says, "I wrote the first episode just on spec. I didn't even pitch it to Sue Virtue, his wife, the TV producer. I, Moffat, just wrote it while we were doing Dracula to pass the time on set, bored at the monitors, frankly." So he was just doodling away on this while Dracula was getting filmed. It wasn't something commissioned or anything. It was just coming to his brain that he was just chipping away with on Dracula. And that's why he decided to cast Dolly Wells in it, because he was seeing how good she was in Dracula and thinking, oh, she would be perfect for this. So it's just kind of ambled out of him, which is interesting because everything else he's done lately has kind of been gestating for a while. Like The Unfriend, like you would know this well, Tyler, that was meant to happen ages ago. Something he wrote years ago now.
Indeed.
The Time Traveler's Wife was an adaptation he had in the works with HBO for quite a few years. And like everything, this is his first show since Coupling back in the early 2000s that isn't like an adaptation, that isn't like based on something, that isn't connected to something else. He's become what he says he doesn't want to be known as a serial adapter, but that's kind of what he became, between Doctor Who and Jekyll and Sherlock and Tintin, Time Traveler's Wife, Dracula. He's been playing around in all these other sandboxes and not just doing a completely original thing again, besides The Unfriend as a play.
Now, as you say, you've adapted some of the biggest and most frequently adapted properties in all of the English language. Is there a specific appeal that you find to lending your voice to tales that have been told multiple times, that have been adapted in multiple ways? That way you get to say, okay, but here is the distinctive version that is mine to some degree?
No, I don't really. I think I'm just a fanboy. I just think there are things that I really love and I want to go. That's it. I don't think anything sort of, I shall now present this to you in a new form. I'm not like that at all. I just think, can I have a go? Oh, Sherlock Holmes, awesome. That's what I think. It's enthusiasm. It's a level of enthusiasm that overflows into the unfortunate event of a television production. That's what it is. I'm not an adapter for hire, and I certainly never ever thought that I would end up being someone that people thought of as, a serial adapter. I don't think of myself that way at all. I'm obviously wrong, but it's enthusiasm. It's absolute enthusiasm. I'd like to go at this, and in a way, I think a good adaptation, a good version of an original, kind of hopefully communicates to an audience what you love about it. That's what, when Mark and I did Sherlock Holmes, we were saying, this is what we love about Sherlock Holmes. These are our favorite bits. It's an act of public worship in a strange way.
So I think it's interesting that the show is his first time doing that in quite a while, and that the show just kind of bubbles up out of nowhere. It's not like something that's been ticking in his brain for years and years, like a lot of his other things. Like he's also said, there's a pile-up. I occasionally find them written on scraps, ideas for stories, and think, I should do that. It's one of the nice things about no longer doing Doctor Who and Sherlock all the time, which is what I did for 7 to 8 years. Every time I had an idea, I had to stand on it and I should fit it into one of those shows. I just quashed it and threw it away. So it's nice now. You can just think, that's an idea. I might go and do that. I might sell that. And so that's what he's doing now. He's doing scraps of ideas, not connected to an IP or not getting funneled into Doctor Who or Sherlock. What do you guys think of all that genesis of the show stuff?
This is what my TV license pays for, is it?
the sense that Moffat is playing around in some way, or doing almost a writerly exercise, just producing all these sketches from his twisted little brain. I think that bleeds into like so much of the show, the way the characters sound and the way in which the storylines are kind of disparate, and even the way in which his trademark fast plotting is kind of deployed to sort of breathtakingly cynical ends. Like at the end of episode 2, it's such a I mean, the twists being sort of piled on here, they're almost sick in the sense of how far can we just make the situation as grotesquely sort of like almost comically bleak as possible. And it's that sense of, I guess, playfulness and almost like nastiness, like a kid playing with insects with a magnifying glass, that it can be very entertaining in some ways, but at the same time it also, I guess, it precludes any sort of wider, deeper significance. Although, obviously, because Moffat is such a writerly person and he's always having observations and opinions and thoughts that will seep through in anything he does, you can see him trying to work through some observations about love, marriages, and stuff like that in the commentary the various characters have on their relationships, and obviously on being a murder. I imagine we will find out what happened between Grief and his wife, maybe later. Hopefully, I'd like to find out. But I think just the underlying framework of the whole thing, it just sort of feels like a bit of marginalia, sort of a bit of fun. And not everyone is going to want to play around in Moffat's little specialized playground.
There's two things on, because we're kind of swirling around, how clever the show is or isn't. There's two things on being clever in my mind right now. The first is something Tyler pointed out to me. It's that the warden in the prison for Grief says clever to Grief. And he's an American. And my understanding is they don't really use the word clever that much like Brits do, or us Commonwealthers do so much. This stuff doesn't bother me, but that doesn't matter because I'm Australian, not American, and they're the ones that get bothered by this stuff, which is, this is like, remember when in Doctor Who, Russell T Davies stuffed up how president-elects what they are or something. He completely got some American political thing wrong. And so a lot of Americans moaned over that back in 2007. You know, getting little things quote unquote wrong about the prison or stuff. I know it annoys a lot of Americans. But Americans will get stuff about Britain wrong all the time. Like I find that stuff a bit weird to care about heaps, because that's just what happens when anyone writes about another country that they don't know super, super, super well, or they haven't lived in or whatever. It surprises me when this is actually a big deal to someone. But hey, I'm not American, so, you know, if it's a big deal to them, yeah.
There's a point to be made, to be fair, about the fact that, Gig, I wonder whether you remember in Sherlock season 3, the whole issue with the tube maps, and Moffat and Gatiss getting the tube maps wrong, and that being like a whole thing on Twitter for about a week between two episodes. Not sure if you remember that happening.
I must admit, I never engaged with online Sherlock fandom, like especially not on Twitter. Like the idea of reading tweets after a Sherlock episode, that gives me fight or flight response. I did not get it.
It's a minor issue really, but it's worth noting, I think, and this happens all the time. You're right, especially in British TV. I actually keep a keen ear out for things like this when I know of a British writer writing American characters, because it happens all the time. But it's not really a huge issue, is it?
I think there's a degree to which there's sort of British TV imagines fantasy America and fantasy Americans. That's almost a genre unto itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like it's maybe a subtle one, but it's there. It's kind of leeching its way through. It's quite entertaining, and sometimes you can spot the sort of the fake accents and just the general strangeness.
People have different thresholds for that kind of stuff too. I think some people will take any depiction of a country by someone who's not in there as like a fictionalization on different levels than other, and even your own country. Like I know in Better Call Saul's last season, there was quite a significant little plot thing around a character spying through like a sewer grate, like they were like, you know, Pennywise in the sewer looking out through to Georgie, like that kind of thing. And Albuquerque doesn't have sewers like that because it's high elevation and it's really dry. There's no need for like flood drain sewers like that. But the show needed that character kind of underground near a certain place, and it's all filmed, you know, very well. The cinematography is great in the sewers, and it's cool how the character skulks around in there. And I saw mixed opinions. Some Albuquerque people were like, yeah, we don't have them, but, you know, it's cool. It makes sense for the story. And other people were like, this, you know, the show is so about this city. To get this wrong really pulls me out of the show and it gives me a bad vibe. I don't think either people are wrong there. It's just people have different thresholds for how fictionalized or how quote-unquote wrong you can take. Like some people can't take accents getting wrong at all. You see people, you know, with Doctor Who, if there's an actor in there who's not actually American is getting the accent wrong, I see some Americans, you know, just roll their eyes and get on with it. And some people get really frustrated. They can't like immerse into the story. I just think people are different with that. It's, you know, fair enough either way. Did you have anything else on that note, Gig?
I was just, when you mentioned the warden guy saying the word clever to Grief, I wondered if you were going to like draw attention to the fact that the most ostentatiously clever character in the story having, you know, people saying, how clever of you to him. Just seems to be
writing.
Piling it on a bit thick, doesn't it?
Well, this ties into my second point about the word clever. This is a quote from Moffat's great interview with The Guardian, which he got a bit crossed over some misquotes in, the one titled Insane Right-Wing Misogynist. You know, I'm not those things. Stephen Moffat on his BAFTAs and whatever. So a quote from that Guardian article is, Moffat stopped writing Sherlock in 2017, but for all that he claims he is not interested in writing more clever crime storylines. Moffat quote, I've consciously tried not to write as aphoristically as I have in the past. He can't help himself. I just think it's interesting that like we've got a quote, he's trying not to write more clever crime storylines. You guys sound like you think he's succeeding in that, at least at least with some of the Grief stuff.
Well, maybe he's succeeding in writing scare quotes clever stories, but not necessarily clever ones in their own right. I think ones that have the aesthetic of cleverness that he's honed to such a degree where you have, you know, some bit of wordplay and that gets retro-engineered into the whole storyline. And he's definitely doing that. Whether he's doing it in a particularly compelling or interesting way is another matter.
I think what's happened is, and I want to be clear, we are going to get into specific stuff in the show soon. It's just some of the overarching Moffat stuff I just think frames stuff interestingly. I think, you know, like in like famous musicians, like especially rock bands and stuff like that. Like they'll have all their first few albums and stuff where they're getting out all the ideas they've had, since they started, and they're struggling, and so they're channeling that into their music and their art. And then, tours are crazy. It's a new experience. They're channeling that. There's all this new stuff getting channeled. And then eventually they get really rich and they get really successful, and they've kind of done everything. Like they've toured in all the countries and they've done all this, and they've had their divorces and they've had their scandals, and it's all like done. And then they might get clean. Like, look at Trent Reznor maybe. He gets clean and he's not depressed anymore and he's all sober, and it's like, then what? And some artists do manage to continue on and iterate and keep doing good stuff, or even do better stuff. I think Trent Reznor might be an example, but a lot of them, especially rock bands and stuff like that, they don't, do they? They either try to get hit with the times and it just crashes and burns, or they just like redo the hits forever, and it's kind of faintly embarrassing. Well, I think Moffat is like, there's two sides to this. One side of it is he's kind of done this before, where he's done all his hits and then he's looked around and I've done everything. And then he did get even better, which is when he was doing Doctor Who, when he got all his ideas out through RTD's run and then through the Matt Smith era, and then he'd done everything. And then he stuck around where he didn't initially mean to, and then he made what I know us three certainly think is the best stuff he ever did with the show, and some of his best work in general in the Peter Capaldi season. So on one side, he's kind of done the thing of surpassing his regular rockstar era and iterating onto the other thing. But on the other side, on his larger era, like, he's done all his big autobiographical stuff, Joking Apart, Coupling especially. He's done all that. And he's done all his big genre things he wants to adapt. He's done Tintin, Sherlock, Dracula, so much Doctor Who. In his words, he says, "The great thing now is I write for my own pleasure. I can write whatever I want." He says he never saw putting his cleverness into Doctor Who as like a shrinking of it or anything. He says, stuff like Doctor Who or Sherlock were so open that they accommodated that cleverness. They weren't shrinking it down. And so now he's saying stuff like, who wants to read the angst-ridden ravings of a middle-class, successful writer who has had his two dream jobs, writing Doctor Who and Sherlock? And so I think there's a kind of, because this is his first original thing in a long time, I think there's this kind of sense of grasping around that hasn't been in something like Time Traveler's Wife. There's so much other stuff going on because it's an adaptation and there's so much baggage with it that there has to be so much creativity in applying himself to that. With an original thing, it's trickier because there's just he's not really, if he's in conversation with anything in the show, it sounds to me like maybe he's in conversation with Sherlock. Like, I think this is a trickier proposition to channel all this creativity when, like he's saying, you're in a really good spot in your life and you've succeeded at so many things and you're just kind of writing on spec. I think it's a kind of tough place for a writer to be. So I'm kind of interested in the kind of grasping around nature of the show's writing.
Yeah, in a way, having huge expectations attached to something, like when you're stepping up to Doctor Who or you're adapting, some of the most famous stories that anyone has ever written, doing a new version of them, there's that pressure to kind of live up to people's ideas of a thing and maybe even surpass them or revolutionize them, turn them on their head and prove yourself. There's all of those pressures kind of have certainly worked on Moffat to produce some unique, interesting bits of writing. I think when you take that away, I think you have Moffat's inherent curiosity, which I don't think is ever going to leave him. But at the same time, you have, maybe you don't really have the impetus kind of behind the whole thing to do something crazy and profound or really like sort of mind-boggling. You just get him sort of toying with things, basically, just having a bit of a play. And for some people, and a drama having a bit of a play is fine. It's not some great insult. But I think if you're hoping for like the next heaven sent, the next hell bent, the next the Doctor Falls or whatever, from Moffat, it's I feel like something like this probably isn't going to be where it comes from.
And I know us three especially, we like Moffat's tunes enough that we're going to be pretty happy if he's doing the rock star thing of, what if I make some more songs just like my old songs? Like, that's still pretty enjoyable just to see the Moffat tropes and the Moffat witticism wheeled out. But yeah, certainly in comparison to Time Traveler's Wife, it feels a little more less purposeful to me so far. But this is also much more of a like show chopped up into 4 quarters more than 4 distinct episodes type of thing it's feeling to me as well. So I might feel very differently after the next 2, but I feel like it's saying less or reaching for less than I felt like a show like Time Traveler's Wife was doing every week with its pretty individual, kind of themed episodes.
There's something a little impersonal about it as well, because you say it's saying less. It also feels to me a bit less like it's less like we're diving into the innermost reaches of Moffat's soul, and more like we're just playing around in like the back of Moffat's head somewhere, and there's like his little fun box that he has going on in the back of his skull somewhere, where all the crazy little sketches and nasty little twists are hiding.
He's said stuff like like in characters say this as well in the show, him speaking through them, like he's interested in, Moffat thinks serial killers are uninteresting because it's a person who likes killing and they go into killing. That's it's like a cricket player playing cricket. It's not that amazing, really, is it? A regular person killing someone, well, that's interesting, because why would they do that? That's not what you're meant to do. For them to do that, something must have gone really strange or really wrong.
I've always wondered what it would take, for a completely decent, a completely normal, morally average or morally good person to kill another decent person. What would it take? Now, we all kind of say, well, I'd never do that, but hey, look at the world. People do it. Murder is interesting. Not, serial killers are a staple of television, but they're actually quite dull. They just like killing. I mean, I think David Tennant, of course, played Dennis Nilsson brilliantly. Amazing, yeah. But, one of the things about Dennis Nilsson, he's really boring. Yeah. He's a very boring man. But, what does it take to take a normal, decent, kind person and trap them in a situation where they honestly believe that their only way out is to kill another normal, decent, honest person?
And then Moffat's also said he's really interested in, but if you ask someone, is there any cause that would ever make you murder someone? If it would save my kid, is what, most adults will probably have as their reason, to save my child. And so he's interested in that.
No, you sort of think, well, would you do it? Would I kill somebody, a normal, decent, honest, kind person, in order to protect my child? Yes. That's it. That's the trouble. Yes. For your child, yes. That's where it all falls apart.
And I think that is interesting, and that is personal, because of course he has kids. It's actually quite obvious he has kids watching this show, given he's playing Tennant's son in it, which is Moffat's own son, of course, one of his sons. And Moff is, personally interested, this is a weird thing to say, Moff is interested in physically how you kill someone. Like Mary says in the episode, and Moff said in interviews.
But then, of course, no one ever talks about this in shows about murder. No one ever talks about it. Bloody hard to kill someone. Yeah. I mean, people don't die that easily. You can't just step on them. No. It takes ages, and it's really difficult, and it's really awkward, and how do you do it? Physically, do you actually know how to stop a person living? I don't. Where'd you get the equipment? Is there an online blog about it? I mean, is there a helpline for killing people? No, it's really hard to kill people. So that's the one thing. That's just, and again, just as a scenario in my own life, what would you do, dear God?
That was another cultural thing that struck me, because I thought, if I were an American watching this, it's like, it's kind of very different in Britain, like with these characters all saying, well, physically, how could you possibly kill someone? How does that work? And I'm thinking, well, yeah, Britain, I guess that is a question. If the Tennant stuff was going on in America, like the Grief stuff, this would be a much shorter conversation.
Yeah. A bit of American asking, how would you kill someone? maybe open your front door, look outside for 5 minutes and you find out.
I thought that was quite endearing of Moff to have like this intellectual curiosity, and I guess a gun just doesn't occur to him. But it's in Britain. He's in Britain, so of course that makes sense. And his other idea is kind of swirling around. These are the surface level themes. I think there's a deeper theme I'll come to a bit later. The other surface level one is like, if you've done a big crime, like morally, is that it? Or can you, like, you see Grief is kind of struggling. It's like, he doesn't want to be forgiven, but is there some level of redemption, or is that the right word? Is there some level of balancing you can kind of do? Is there some, to what extent can you do good if you've done something that bad?
And the other one was sort of almost at the other end of that, which is, suppose you knew you'd done the unacceptable, the terrible, awful, dreadful, unforgivable thing, and you've been found out and you're sitting in prison. What do you do with the days you have left? Is there any redemption? Is there anything you could do that would make things better? Given that you don't expect to be forgiven, I don't think, there are things that are unforgivable, but could you do anything that would balance the books? What would you do with your days if you knew that you were officially abominable, what would you do with your days?
I find that kind of theme a little tired, just because I feel like I've experienced it so much, but it is an idea of the story. But those kind of ideas do feel, like Gig said, less personal to me than like the kind of deeper stuff about love, in some of his other shows, or deeper stuff about ego. These are more, what would it be like to kill someone? It's a little more of an intellectualization thing, I think. What do you think, Tyler?
I was wondering, do you really think that's what he's toying with, that the theme that you mentioned of how much good can a murderer do? I'm not really sure that's what he's doing. I think the point that he was trying to, when I was talking about the Tucci moralizing to Beth thing, I think the point he was making is that he's not doing that. He's explicitly not doing the how much moral good can this guy do, and he was what I felt was that, okay, I understood your point, Moffat. You've hammered this home enough. You're not making a point about he's doing good. It's just something that this guy is doing, and maybe it's some kind of penance, and maybe it's some kind of atonement. But you don't really care. I don't really care. Let's move on from it. And he made it enough times.
I think that ties into what I think the actual big theme of the show is, because what you're getting at there is like what Greef is kind of saying is kind of bullshit, right? Like it's kind of self-serving, and he's like dressing up as, well, I don't want, you can't possibly print this, Beth, because then people would like me, and you can't do that. You've got to have the moral fortitude to have no one like me, because if I'm doing it for applause, blah 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 blah. So it's all like kind of saying I'm trying not to be egocentric, but it's nothing but ego, really, isn't it? Because it's all about my definition of moral worth, and what I'm gonna take this, and it's like, I'm not saying it's bad. Like, I'm glad that he didn't take the rapist's case on and everything, but he's lying to himself, to pretend it isn't to do with ego, or on some level to do with applause. Like, Dylan is right there constantly giving him the applause he wants. Like, we have that whole thing in episode 1 with the rapist. What's the nature of the bill thing that's getting sent to the senator? And that's all applause from Dylan. That's the whole thing, is him trying to patronizingly teach Dylan, like he later tries to teach Beth, how to solve the crime so he can feel smart about himself for having solved it originally. Like, it's all for applause. So I think Greef is lying to himself. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Tyler, that there's that bullshit aspect to what he's saying. Yeah. And I think lies are the big theme of the show, actually. And this is something I heard Moffat himself say. You know how he likes to spill the whole themes of his shows in interviews here and there. Well, he's saying the whole kind of what he's really exploring with the show, more than those other themes, is the thing with Harry, with Tennant's character, is that he's I hesitate at decent, because I think he's actually quite bad in some ways, but he's bad in normal ways that I think lots of people or men like him are bad. But he's a normal person, basically. He's not that bad, in comparison to Greef. Well, he might be that bad. He's a normal guy, basically. His issue, his tragic flaw, is that he lies.
What is precisely wrong with Harry? Because he's a good man. He's a decent man. He's a kind man. But he's just got one thing. He doesn't tell the truth.
No.
He just think, no, you're not in control. And what is lying? What is lying? Lying is making yourself the author of events. It's making you think you're entitled to alter what happened to something better so that you can take control of it. It is the ultimate arrogance. You are not in charge of events. And he tries to be. And he's not trying to be for profit or for his own benefit or even for his own ego, but it's just... And I kept thinking, is there a moral to the story at all? It's don't lie.
Yeah.
Just tell the bloody truth.
I know.
And if however it plays out, it'll be, that's just what's going to happen. It only becomes your fault when you lie. So the fact he keeps trying to control that conversation when he shouldn't, when it's not his right, it doesn't make him a bad man. I think it makes him a relatively typical man.
Yeah.
He's mansplaining in the face of destiny, and you just can't.
Moffat says it's the ultimate arrogance to think you can be in charge of events, or you can play God, and you can narrativize things better. But he's lying to try, because he thinks he can control things. Which is similar to Greef, who's, he's kind of lying because his version of events, his version of himself is, one he prefers and one he thinks he can kind of exert over other people. And so I think the bigger idea of the show is about the nature of lying and the nature of trying to rewrite events with yourself as the author. Like we see at the end of episode 2, Tennant's lies, as you know, okay, a plot as they were, they all fall apart because he tried to put himself... Well, the thing is, he tried to put himself above God, basically. He tried to put himself above what actually happened by saying, here's my version of events, which I think can get me out of all these issues that I've caused and that other people have caused. But it can't work because there's always more going on in the world than you can possibly tie up in your lies. And so the note that Edgar leaves behind is going to screw up his lies. And so I think Moffat says Harry mansplains in the face of destiny, and that to try and author events is vanity beyond vanity. So I think this lying stuff is kind of the bigger message of the show than the more general, how do you do a crime? Or, it's crazy what parents do for their kids, right? Kind of stuff.
Yeah, see, now you mentioned lying being like a major theme. I was just thinking of the 2 mini cases and how in both cases, the senator who comes to him in episode 1 is lying about having supposedly not raped any of those women.
Yeah.
And then in episode 2, the woman, the mother who comes along with her daughter is lying about not knowing where her husband is. So that's interesting. I hadn't really noticed that until you just pointed this out right now. So yeah, there definitely seems to be some truth to that.
We open with a lie, don't we? We open on the tube with Donald Wells lying about having Facebook Live. And this obviously is a good lie. This is a lie that helps another person, and it doesn't really do anybody any harm, it only does good. But then, again, we have Beth's lie, the journalist's lie, that they're just going to meet for a coffee. And then again, you have Dolly Wells's lie, where you find out it's a lie in episode 2. She's sort of lying by default, by sort of being jolly with the vicar. So all that really happens in the very opening sequence is a series of various lies, even with the Dolly Wells and Lydia West characters.
That's a good observation. Yeah, you're right. I also, Beth being a writer, a journalist, those are always interesting characters in stories, aren't they? Moffat says she represents the amorality of the writer, because she's kind of lying to herself, which is what Grief tries to expose, that, I'm doing this to help out my friend, the person I met once, person who saved me. And, he exposes that lie by his little play with, you got to never mention her again, and then you can watch my other case. And, you're not above your readers. You think you're so above them, and you think, you're higher than all this true crime stuff. But your readership and, therefore your money comes from people. You're producing the stuff for the demographic you think you're above. So therefore, how above are you? So Lydia's kind of Beth's hypocrisy, as a writer, keys into that lying stuff as well. The train thing that opens the show then, that Tyler brought up, I liked that. I liked that Lydia's character wasn't a hero in it as well. She was kind of diminutive in it, and only Dolly Wells's character, Janice, stood up to him, and then empowered the other woman who started actually doing the Facebook Live thing, who knew how to use their phones better to actually do it. I liked the guy. Like the misunderstanding or the kind of aggressive, purposeful misunderstanding of, the law and stuff, to say that's assault, and, the kind of insane hypocrisy of that when, he was the one actually, getting in someone's personal space and touching them. I thought that was all the dialogue was a bit heightened, but a fairly true to life kind of exchange, especially because, one of our hero ladies didn't do anything in it, I thought was the interesting note in that.
And again, that guy on the train is kind of, trying to create the narrative or control the narrative, just the way that you talked about, like Harry trying to do. In a way, he felt entitled to just dictate reality for everyone else on the train. And obviously, that got turned on its head because people had, well, not necessarily actually evidence against him, but their own version of the narrative to sort of overtake his, I guess.
We've spoken before about a scene in another Moffat show, Jekyll, in which the Dr. Jekyll character is confronted by a group of thugs, and his partner is humiliated, and the line that really sticks, because it's so shocking and quite really humiliating, is "just let him." He says, "I'm sorry, just let him," and this is kind of like a retribution of that. I thought it's like a "just let him" scene, except there's a savior to it. So I thought, just in talking about Moffat regularities, this is like a redemption for a previous thing that he. We won't go too far into it because as Neo says, he hasn't actually seen Sherlock, but there is a similar scene in Sherlock as well, in which there's a just let him moment.
I think there's a couple of interesting gender things in the show like that. Even coming after the train scene, we have the ballsy is a strange compliment between women line from Janice. Later on, we have Grief saying to the senator, "Why did all those actresses thank Harvey?" You know, kind of piercing at the senator's simplistic view of, the nonsense he's spinning there. But the first super interesting gender thing that showed to me was Tennant's character looming by the door when Dolly Wells, she's a tutor. I don't know if she's a teacher, but clearly, she works with children. She has a duty of care. She's going to report it. This isn't the type of person that's not going to report what she thinks has happened. So to try and get control of the situation there, I mean, he's lying in that he's saying, "Oh, I am letting you leave. I'm not blocking the door," while he's blocking the door. But that's, I think so many people, especially women, but not only women, can think of situations they've been in like that where a guy is using his body and his, physicality and his size to trap you or to stop you leaving, even if they're saying they're not, or they're trying to be friendly about it. They're using their strength and they're using their body to trap you, which is really scary. That he was doing that, especially as he's trying to put on such a nice face to it, and then he actually blocks the door. I thought all this stuff was well played and freakier than the more heightened Grief and Dylan stuff going on in America. I thought that was quite chilling. Tennant using his body like that, and the way Tennant is used in episode 1 is really good because he's Tennant playing a pretty likable guy. So we're really quickly endeared to like him because everyone likes David Tennant, and he's like a cool priest. He's a cool vicar. He's got so many good lines. The God loves atheists. Chest colds are permanent. The average age is 72. Every long night's a cliffhanger. There's all these funny lines, and he swears a little bit, but not too much. He's really, really likable. I loved the line God's still existing, but it was a close thing. You had to sermon like a badass to keep God, happening. He's really funny and likable. So we get endeared to him quickly. So when he starts using his being a tall man to kind of physically impose over someone, it kind of chills you in that way of, like Janice says, "I thought I liked him, but I guess I never did," later on to Mary. It's, that kind of, someone can kind of turn on a dime in those situations. So I thought that stuff was pretty scary.
I wanted to bring up that scene because Tennant's physicality in that scene is brilliant. It's probably my favourite performance of the show up to this point. Is the scenes in which Tennant is physically threatening Janice, because what you've got is as you mentioned, you've got this quite violent and aggressive physicality, but what Tennant does is his face and his voice are quite gentle as this vicar, and they're quite warm. He's got this warm and gentle voice, and she's saying, "Why are you blocking me?" While he's physically blocking her, and he's going, "I'm not." And he's got this nice gentle tone and this lovely placid face, but he's physically quite threatening. So I think that's great.
When he breaks the phone, he's like, "Well, I've got a handset over there. You can take it. What service are you on?" I assume the phone thing was an accident. I don't think he was intentionally trying to break a phone, but still the kind of domineering someone, then saying all these things to act like you're a nice guy. Like in episode 2, when he comes down with the handcuffs and he keeps reflexively saying sorry as he's telling the woman trapped in his basement, "Handcuff yourself." And so there's all that implicit threat of violence, because how else is she going to stay there? If she tried to run, he's not going to let it happen. He will physically stop her. He will use violence to stop her. That's really creepy. The kind of nice man, he's being gentle and he's apologizing, but there's all that threat of his body simmering underneath it all. I think that's really chilling.
There's a Shearsmith and Pemberton thread of humour to this. The Inside Number 9 style of seriously dark content with a thread of consistent humour. I don't think there's really been a moment, or there's only been a couple of moments so far that feel properly threatening. The dialogue generally has been consistently quite funny and quite and quite calm. And this is obviously the Tennant placidness thing that I was mentioning. But every scene in the cellar has reminded me very much, and I wonder if Moffat has actually taken a leaf from Inside Number 9. There are a couple of episodes not dissimilar to this, in which somebody is trapped or somebody's in a basement, or there are threads of comedy in that that are kind of inescapable.
Yeah, I think the idea of the nice guy who is actually just incredibly fucking intensely creepy, even without even necessarily like being aware of what he's doing. Like the breaking the phone, for example, that's so indistinguishable from a malicious act, but he just seems to do it unthinkingly, like accidentally. And it's just the way, and just by being, oh, I'm just nice and normal, I'm a decent, reasonable person. But as we can all plainly see, you know, his actions are spinning further and further out of control and into, you know, just horror and chaos. I think that's a really impressive and cool thing, I think, to put on screen, just because it sort of undercuts, I guess, just the bullshit idea of like just the nice bloke who didn't mean to do any of it, you know, because it's just such a. I think when watching it, I'm not inclined to make excuses for Harry, really, or like it will be that, or sympathise with him that much, because he just seems to be like. There's just such this weird level of hypocrisy running throughout his whole character. So it's quite a case study in something really horrific going on there. I think I loved in episode 2 when he's in the church trying to, basically invoking all the powers of God and himself as a vicar to try and make Edgar confess to this crime so he can get it on audio tape on the phone. And the music is kind of going full like Murray Gold, super emotional. Oh my God, this is so serious and religious. And it's just like this craven, like blatantly self-serving agenda. And I was just cackling my head off at that. I thought that was so funny. I love that sort of comic morbidity of just completely undermining the sort of the folksy morality of one thing or another. But of course, eventually, his conscience or whatever wins out, and Harry ends up giving up on that plan. So, it's it's quite fascinating in its own way.
I did think about you guys with the Chinese leaflets moment, the moment where the vicar brings down a couple of Chinese restaurant leaflets, and what I thought about was you guys as Breaking Bad fans. You'll remember the scene where Walter White brings down sandwiches to what's his name, Emilio, and the really dark, disturbing knowledge that there's something really disgusting happening here, but this character's too sort of placid and meek to do anything about it quite yet, and is trying to placate the situation.
Yeah, especially because the food was Mary's idea, and I think Mary is the one that's being more overtly scary about stuff. Like, she's the one that is bringing up actual murder earlier on, and she instantly colludes with her husband as well. Like, she's the one that's being quite forward. She comes down with the golf club and everything. And so for the food to come from her, it's like Walt cutting off the crust. It's like this absurdity of trying to do something nice and normal amongst, you know, you have someone in your basement you're thinking of killing.
What do you guys think about Mary, like the wife, just as a character in general? Because I kind of feel that in terms of making her the more aggressive one, and also making her a drunkard, and kind of having her be the one sort of flipping out and almost going on that almost trance-like monologue about different ways to kill someone, and just like generally the way in which she seems to be set up as this element of chaos in the storyline. I find something a little bit underwhelming about it all, because it feels kind of cheap to make the wife this one, especially, you know, making her drunk and making her so like so emotive or whatever. I don't know. It just. And the one who feels like she could be the most likely to snap and kill someone in the story so far, the impression I get from Mary. And I'm just wondering, I wonder, could it have been more interesting if she was slightly more like a bit slightly more, not like Harry, but more on a level with Harry in terms of composure and just sort of being in control of herself more. I don't know.
There comes a moment in most straight male writers' careers where they will write a Lady Macbeth. And this is Moffat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Moffat sounds very impressed with Mary. Like, I was listening to these interviews where he's like saying,
I think if you watch the first episode, you're not going to realize just how significant Mary's going to be. And that's a deliberate trick.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, really, we, you know, although she's a very, very major character, and we don't sort of tell you that at the beginning. She sort of plays the comedy wife, then she plays the exasperated wife. And you think, well, that's what she's going to be, the vicar's wife, and she's anything bloody.
She's brilliant. Yeah.
But no, I loved writing Mary. because do you know that I always feel there should be that Mary should turn up in most detective shows and point out and say, no, this doesn't make sense. Don't do that. Why would you do that? Don't be bloody stupid.
And as she's really working out exactly, I mean, I'm not giving anything away, but yeah, she can be absolutely aware how stupid it is, but whatever's going to happen because.
And she's funny. She's a funny person.
Yeah.
She says funny things even in the face of the abyss.
I have the feeling she's going to be really important in the last 2 episodes. Like I think something's
100%.
brewing. Yeah, between
absolutely.
her and her husband. Like I assume there's one of them's going to drop at the other's hand. It is just what it feels like it's building to me.
But what are you currently feeling at the moment? It's only 2 episodes are released.
I don't know the mechanics of getting there. Just the kind of vibe I get from the storytelling. Is Mary going to kill Harry? Like, is Tennant going to die by his
I
wife?
agree. Yes, this is what I thought.
Yeah.
Good. I'm okay. That's interesting. I'm glad we're all on the same page about that.
Just the shape of the story feels like that.
I think episode 2 really seemed to point towards Mary killing Harry, and the thing is, it didn't go as far as saying it or having Mary like contemplate killing Harry like explicitly or anything like that. But there were multiple points, like sort of parts that sort of all point towards it without it being explicit. So Janice asks Mary, "What could you do for me that would make me help you?" Now, considering I hate your husband so much, think about that. And we don't know what Mary's answer to that question is. And then you also have, of course, the B plot where you find out the woman has murdered her husband. And then, of course, you have Grief's implied backstory. We don't know what happened between him and his wife, but he's a spousal killer as well. And I think in all these murders, this matrix of murders that Moffat is writing about, I think the one that probably interests him the most, or the type of murder, is the spousal murder. The idea of like loving someone who you are married to, but nonetheless killing them. And there's that comment, I think, that Jefferson says, murder is rarely an expression of indifference, right? So it's like the idea of to be in such a close relationship, but nonetheless have something that you would kill them for. And I think probably it's the same thing as in the rest of the story to protect Ben. If she thinks she can somehow protect Ben by killing Harry, then she'll do it. But yeah, I still have no idea how the grief stuff is going to slot into it. But so everything's on the table, but it does seem very sort of weighted towards Mary killing Harry at this point.
I think it's kind of it's the classic put Jack forward and keep Ruth in the back kind of moment of you hide a twist behind a twist, where it's like Moffat's saying the show is about, what can make a normal person kill a normal person. And so you think the thread of it is like, what can make, David Tennant kill, the maths tutor of his son. But I think that's not the normal person killing a normal person the show's actually about. I assume it's going to be the more interesting one of what can make a spouse kill a spouse, especially if, they're relatively in love and everything like Grief talks about. So yeah, I don't really have any plot predictions for how it's going to happen. It's just the kind of vibe of the story and the sixth sense of what Moffat likes to write. It's a classic boomer humor gender thing, isn't it? Like your wife killing your husband, or wife killing your husband kind of thing. It just feels like where it's going to go to me.
Especially now that, as of the end of episode 2, Harry has sort of condemned himself and sort of put himself in the role of he thinks he's put himself in the role of the paedophile, but of course Edgar's suicide note has made him the person who's protecting the paedophile. So it's like, yeah, it's all a mess. But yeah, he seems to be in the position of expendable somehow.
The thing with Edgar at the end, like I thought that was pretty powerful and everything. Am I nitpicking to feel like it was kind of contrived that his note was like the vicar is covering for someone, or it did like not specifying himself? That just felt like, to me, maybe I'm nitpicking, it felt like a kind of writerly thing to keep Ben, the son, kind of in play as who could be the pedophile. Like, why wouldn't he write his own name, Edgar, if he's killing himself? Or am I being unsympathetic with the suicidal kind of character? Like, what do you guys think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's no good reason to. It's just a avoidance and it is a writerly thing. It's a bit sort of Agatha Christie, isn't it? I mentioned Father Brown earlier. It's a bit G.K. Chesterton. It's that kind of stuff. You can't avoid it really in a murder mystery, can you?
Well, would it have been better or worse if Moffat had given Edgar and Ben the same name, so he could put the actual name on the note?
Or the same initials. I suppose you could have done something with the initials, couldn't you?
I think the suicide note thing is absolutely a writerly contrivance of the highest order. It struck me as sort of darkly funny in the incredibly sort of twisted, sort of basically a very sick sense of humor kind of way, because in a way it's like even in death, even in literally his last act on this earth, the paedophile still sort of like passes the buck and cannot actually admit like what he did, his own crime. So it's like it's extremely sort of bleak and cynical in a way, but it's also set up to create the maximum amount of the way it's positioned. We get that monologue over and over with Harry saying, well, as long as Ben is safe, then it was all worth it. As long as no one believes I am a paedophile, it's all worth it. And then we see the note literally saying, don't believe the vicar is a paedophile. It's like the deliberate contrast there. It's like, I think it's trying, I mean, obviously it's the most writerly thing ever, but it's trying to, I think it's more about how naive and foolish Harry's actions have been than necessarily like how realistic the situation is, or how like or how suspenseful it is that the suicide note says that. I think it's more that he's put himself in even bigger shit. And obviously the story is constructed in such a way so that will happen. But again, that's what it brings back to what I said earlier, that sense that Moffat is playing with these characters like the little insects and just contriving the maximum amount of suffering for them.
Something I really loved with the USB drive stuff, and this is a kind of writerly thing, is, you know, when writers can do something where you have a scene play one way the first watch and then you get the scene to play a total different way if someone rewatches it, which I loved was when Janice puts the USB drive in the computer and sees the contents. You know, she looks disgusted, and Ben comes in, and you know, this is Moffat, so there's lots of pornography jokes, and we've already had the vicar like talking about, oh, the internet's off because, you know, our son's drained all the naked women out of the internet or whatever. So we're having a cavalier approach to pornography in the show so far, like in lots of Moffat's works. Like his first Matt Smith episode had a whole little running thing about porn on a guy's computer, as I recall, and of course it's been in Joking Apart second season premiere. Pretty intense plot line about pornography. Anyway, Moffat likes writing about porn, browser history jokes, and Doctor Who. So we're kind of trained to take, and in general, you know, porn jokes in these kind of BBC shows will be this kind of boys will be boys, you know, kind of stuff, I think. Over on ITV, you know, in Chibnall Land, Broadchurch deals with this stuff very differently. But over here, porn's been talked about in a light way. And so you have Ben like going, yep, you know, it's a normal stage in development. You've seen my porn, you know, it's, you know, pretty bad, but, you know, we're working through it and everything. And the mum's like, oh, sorry you had to see that, Janice. And Tennant's just like, ugh, you know, and he was joking about it earlier. So the first time you see that scene, it's funny. Like, I thought Ben's dialogue was funny. It's just like typical Moff porn jokes kind of thing that's funny. And then, you know, when you watch it again after, because your blood runs cold after Janice says it's kids, and then you go, oh, fuck, you know, that it sets the whole story on fire. And so I went and I rewatched the scene before it, and it just feels so chilling to see everything Ben's saying there and realizing how Dolly Wallace's character would be interpreting it, and like the way he's being so cavalier about it. It's just, it'd be so overloading to the senses. You know, if she was more calm, maybe it would trigger off that why on earth is he speaking so casually about, you know, something so evil and illegal. But just in the actual moment of it, that scene plays so differently when you get the twist of it, which I thought was really cool.
My experience with that scene was slightly different because pretty much the moment she put the USB drive in and we sort of don't immediately find out what it is, I was like, in my head, I was like, it's going to be kids, isn't it? It's going to be something really horrific or illegal. So when we got that dialogue of kind of Ben and Harry and all of the family sort of joking about it, like while Janice just staring in horror at the screen, like, what the fuck are they talking about? Like, it felt not necessarily like blood run cold, kind of chilling, but almost it reminded me. Essentially, it's fast plotting again, because it's like when the characters, just because they don't know the full situation, they just casually talk like nothing's wrong, and they end up like digging themselves deeper and deeper and deeper into the, oh my god, this is horrible. So it's sort of like that, but about a topic that's not really funny, like, at all. So it was sort of that, I don't know, it's hard to quite pin down like how it felt, but it was sort of like anti-comedy in a way. It's sort of a sort of a farcical thing happening, but but leading to a situation that I could tell is going to be, oh no, stop, this is so bad. So sort of like the not darkly funny, but sort of it's the kind of thing that is structured like comedy but is horrifying. And I that's sort of, I don't know if there's a word for that, but that's sort of how it came to me. So it's sort of, I think it works both ways. Yeah.
Tyler, what did you think of that scene?
Yeah, similarly to Gig, I'd kind of pieced it together. I pieced it together when the mother is beating him in the church, and she says something like, "Is it the same kind as usual?"
You're both too genre savvy. I was the stupid viewer getting hooked in.
I did. It's like a slightly different thing, but while we're talking about the scene, I did wonder for a brief moment whether this would be, because I knew that Dolly Wells was trapped in a cellar. That was part of the marketing, as you mentioned. So I did wonder whether the whole family was going to accidentally be a part of where so something happens and accidentally, because they're all in the room and they're all justifying the porn and stuff. So I wondered whether something is going to happen in which now the whole family have to deal with this thing in like a darkly comic, farcical kind of way, which I suppose might have been the case had it been, I mentioned Inside Number 9, if it was a Shearsmith Pemberton type thing, but being Moffat, it's more of it's like a spousal thing, isn't it? And the kind of things that you do for your kids. But yeah, so that's another point that doesn't really lead anywhere or go anywhere, but I thought it was worth mentioning.
I'm glad. The only marketing I engaged with was like when the show got announced or whatever, or the first press release. I remember David Tennant's in it and Stanley Tucci's a criminal or something. But then because I knew I'd be watching it, because it's a Moffat show, I didn't engage with anything. So I felt really happy that I got the whole... Tennant seemed totally charming to me, on first watch. I had no idea the show would be heavy enough to, like have child exploitation stuff in it. Yeah, it's a joy sometimes to not watch trailers for anything. I haven't watched the trailer stuff for The Devil's Hour with Capaldi either, so I'm looking forward to sort of surprises or whatever with how that's going to go. Sometimes it's nice to be the stupid viewer, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of times in these two episodes, Moffat seems to be catering to viewers who maybe didn't quite get it on the first time it was explained. So something you think to explain 3 times in a row.
With the Edgar stuff, with the church stuff, I thought that was really interesting. There's certain stuff in the story that would only make sense if you're doing it in this kind of way. Like the lengths Tennant goes to, this isn't stuff, I think people in other jobs necessarily would be. Like the whole child exploitation stuff has a special factor to him, given, that he's not Catholic, but he's a vicar and everything. I thought the church stuff was really interesting to me. Also because I was raised quite Catholic. So to see all this Church of England stuff, I was Googling away, why does it work that way over there? Like it was interesting to me to see how this all, even stuff like the vicar having a family, like that must be normal over there, but that was really interesting to me to see that. And some of the like the stakes of it. So he's like the spiritual leader and everything, and he's got his son. I think it's really interesting the way he kind of used God in episode 2 in that sequence, Gig found sort of funny where the music is blaring and everything. And he's acting like the vessel of God, but he's not just trying to like selfishly save his own skin. That's not the only thing he's trying to do, but he is using all this stuff cynically. Basically, I found all that Church of England stuff really, really interesting. Yeah, and I think that flavors how the child exploitation stuff comes across. Because it makes it more believable, I think, the lengths Tennant's character is going to. Because it's like Mary says, is what would the narrative around this be? If this got out, the tabloids would feast, as the most they have since Megan won an Oprah or whatever she said.
I think the really thorny thing with Harry and Edgar and the religion stuff, I think it happens in both of these episodes. Harry has a moment where he could dob in Edgar, but he decides, okay, I'm not going to, because he feels, I guess, as a vicar, as a spiritual leader or whatever, he feels this responsibility to protect, I guess, those he perceives as like the weaker from something, from consequences, I guess, or from things that he feels that they cannot endure. So, and I think, maybe a lot of other people in that situation wouldn't necessarily feel someone who's, devouring child porn, on a little private USB drive deserves that kind of sort of, or at least deserves to be protected in such a way that endangers them. Like would you like put yourself in the firing line for the sake of someone for even like a suicidal, severely mentally troubled, child
Yeah.
porn consumer, would you do that? So I think it's that sense that because he feels that there is a responsibility on him from God or whatever to be the vicar, be the person who has that moral beauty or whatever to him, like that spiritual beauty, that Christ-like self-sacrificing nature, to go that far in defense of this character. It's very specific, I think. And I think maybe it sort of undermines the whole idea that this could happen to anyone. But like, again, it plays back into that idea of being the master narrative person, trying to put yourself in that narrative, trying to create the narrative of what you're doing.
It's like he has the flashes to seeing the self-harm scars on Edgar's arms, and it's like what gives him the self-righteousness to think, I have to be the one to save him. I can't sell him out, or I can't do this because look, I'm the spiritual leader and he's the sad boy. But it's such like when Edgar's lying on the floor, he's like saying, it's not. Why can't anyone just leave me alone? It's not hurting anyone. He's like saying nonsense like that. This whole idea that it's a victimless crime is consumption or acquiring or purchase or however he's channeling into, those evil materials like he's gotten. Like it's such nonsense, and I hate the kind of like the Tennant's characters seeing it all as so frail and like so powerless, Edgar, because he's a very weak man and he's a very troubled man. He kills himself in the end. He was self-harming and everything, but it's such a simplistic. And I think it speaks to how he sees his like how he sees his religion here. Tennant's character to be like, I protect him because he's the frail one. It's very black and white, basically. I think how he's seeing it, and he's putting himself above the law. The law is sacred, Jimmy. He's putting himself above the police. He's putting himself above, society in general to try and save. And is he even saving this man exactly? Like, he knows his mum hits him, evidently, but he just leaves the room when it happens. And then he hits him himself later when he's saying, you never go near that stuff again. And then he's thumping him in the chest, similar to how his mum is saying, you got to stop doing that, as she's hitting him quite a bit harder. But
not to go to bat for the whole carceral system, whatever. But I can't help but think that maybe prison might be preferable to living with that mother.
Yeah.
At least where Edgar's concerned. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the fact that Harry's attempt to save his soul or whatever ultimately doesn't work, and Edgar kills himself anyway. That seems like a big rebuke to everything Harry was just thinking with that, and just his whole ideology there.
I think it was quite self-aggrandizing how he dealt with Edgar, basically, to think he could deal with it better than. Well, he thinks he can deal with it better than the mother, but he leaves him with the mother to go hit him. He doesn't really try to intervene with that. He just tries to like passive aggressively call the mum out. Like to think he's dealing with this better than the law could by not really doing anything at all. We see where that ended up. A man's dead, and Tennant and his son are in danger of getting accused of. I mean, Tennant's done some crimes, but he hasn't done that one. So yeah. Yeah, he's bungled it.
There's a couple of reasons that this character is a priest. The first one being that it's a bit of a sort of boyish Moffat joke. That isn't it funny that the vicar now looks like he's a paedophile? And I think that's probably the conception of the idea. But the more interesting one is we spoke about the leadership and the egotism that comes from this, and the idea of being above the law. I think that where this character. A person of any other profession, and any other, like a teacher, which Dolly Wells is obviously he's in contrast with a teacher, or a police officer, because we mentioned the law. This would not pan out the same way that it does. The reason that it does is because of his belief in there only being one true judge, and that he is his representative on earth, and he ought to do that job. So that I find quite interesting, and I think that this is something that Tennant has done before, isn't it? He's done this in Doctor Who, quite interestingly there as well, where he's kind of a god on earth, which is really it's made really obvious by the end of episode 2, when you mentioned Tennant kind of thumping Edgar on the chest and saying, "You don't do this again." He said, what you do is. Whenever you are tempted, whenever you experience temptation, you remember what I did for you. Obviously, harking Christ.
Literally making himself to Christ. Yeah,
literally making himself God, making himself the Son of God, in that Jesus died for one's sins. So I find this very interesting, and I think that it does diminish the idea of this could happen to anyone. What if just a normal guy went through, because this guy isn't a normal guy. This guy is God's representative on Earth, and feels that very deeply.
I feel like maybe Moff, no matter how hard Moff tries, maybe he can't write normal people. I think maybe his impulses as a writer are to find the interesting or like twisted characters who have, especially men who think too much of themselves. That's a really major theme with pretty much everything Moffat has ever written. So I think he naturally gravitates towards this kind of story, and yeah, it is really fascinating. I love when he was in the church, literally looking at the stained glass windows of Jesus on the cross, and that was his moment of an epiphany. Okay, I will be the paedophile. I will take the rap. It's like it's so absurd in so many ways, and again, it's sort of darkly funny just for how absurd it is. But yeah, it's really quite fascinating, and it does nonetheless put him more in the crosshairs to be the one who dies, given that he's already made himself into Jesus Christ.
I think a lot of writers start off a premise with like, what if a normal person did something crazy? Like Tyler brought up Breaking Bad earlier, and I know a lot of the seed of that show was Vince Gilligan thinking, how could I turn Mr. Chips into Scarface? How could I turn a totally normal, decent guy into like a crime lord? And yeah, the elevator pitch kind of is that, but as the show goes on, and even in season 1, like the idea kind of more is there's this man who outwardly is quite decent and lives quite decently for a long time, but there's actually this kind of odious, rotten core to him, and that kind of galvanizes over the course of the show, and that's very frightening for his family and everything. And the show kind of gets more interested in a more three-dimensional character who kind of unravels, rather than this guy was really good and then he becomes really bad. So I think, what if normal person did crazy thing is often just kind of the start of a premise more than what the premise of something actually ends up being. Because Tennant's character is standard in some ways, but he's not your average guy. He's an average guy in some of the things, like the creepy way he uses his body, blocking the door, and his charisma and everything. He's pretty normal in those ways, but a lot of things he's doing are quite specific, like the religious stuff. Yeah. So I think, but there's nothing wrong with coming up with a more interesting character than an everyday bloke.
Yeah. Like at the end of the day, thrillers and drama don't really arise from people who are perfectly, normal and adjusted and do the right thing in all situations and have that nice, conflict-free cause to them. Drama comes from characters who are in their own way quite fucked up. So that's where the events and conflict come from.
Well, you have to ask who is the normal character of the show, and if we're all in agreement that it's obviously not the Tennant character, it's not the vicar, then I would argue that then it's Mary, isn't it? Which is my reasoning for Mary is going to be the killer. I don't think that Tennant's going to do any killing in the show. I don't think anybody else is going to do any killing. I think that Mary is going to be the. Grief says it. What does he say? It says it takes a good reason and a bad day, and there's a couple of lines like that. And I think that will be the point. I think Mary snapping will be the point.
I like that because it kind of generally, like, the parents being protective of their child is usually seen as a good thing, societally, or like a, mama bear's going to protect her cubs kind of thing. It's like a sweet thing in a lot of ways, but no, it can be really terrifying, really. The lengths, parents can go to protect their children, they can go to insane lengths, which is what we're probably going to see here. And I like something that's outwardly good or, shallowly just seems like a good and great thing. I like the idea of kind of, well, if you take it to the logical conclusion there, or, well, maybe not logical, if you take it to a further extent there, it can be quite a terrifying thing, parents being protective of their kids. So Mary doing that could be interesting, yeah. Killing for her son.
So I have to wonder, where does that, if we've sort of decided that Mary's kind of the normal sort of person in a sense, and Harry's sort of the God figure, Christ on earth, whatever, and Jefferson is like made himself into this sort of ridiculous, he's lying to himself about all this stuff. Like, where does that leave Janice? Because we haven't really talked about her very much, like as a character, but as the one who gets locked in the cellar and is trying to, I guess, play some sort of game to maybe possibly either get revenge or get her freedom somehow. Like, she has to do a lot of talking. She has to she's sort of the one who's been put into this completely insane situation and is trying to maybe escape it or somehow. And she has a lot of the Moffatish dialogue of being like, "Oh, I'm like a bacillus in your basement," and sort of the one whose brain is going like 1,000 miles an hour, like calculating all these things. So she's that. I guess she's that kind of character, and obviously she's reminiscent of Agatha from Dracula. So that kind of completely, wisecracking, like really sort of super, sort of incisive character. Like, how well do you think like she's working so far, like as a character?
Well, I think she's a Skype call tomorrow at 9 p.m. with her sister.
Yeah. Well, not if it gets cancelled. She hasn't. So.
Yeah. Well, I feel like her and Beth are kind of a bit less. They're a bit more devices enabling like the other. This isn't totally a gender thing because I think Mary's quite important in the story. But I think it's like the classic. If you got a thin story, you cast a great British actor and they'll make it seem like there's more depth to it than it is. I think Lydia West and Dolly Wells are the kind of actors you can throw at something and they're going to make characters that might be a bit devicey seem more rounded because they're so good at the kind of Moffat dialogue and their deliveries and everything. So I hope they get more to do themselves in the next 2 episodes. But yeah, like she does a very interesting job of it. But so far, Janice is just kind of the woman in the basement in terms of the story, I guess.
Janice is where it becomes obvious that, as you say, Moffat was writing this around the same time as Dracula or on set of Dracula, and he's thinking, "Oh, Dolly Wells is pretty good at this, isn't she?" And he's sort of doing the same sort of thing in the same sort of way, which is okay. There's nothing. I'm not disparaging a writer doing similar things in a similar way. But when it is literally the same actress coming down to the same sort of lines, using the same sort of tactics, it is a little bit. You do have to stop and think, okay, is there nothing else you could have done with this character? But what I have to say is that I do really like Dolly Wells, and I can understand the appeal of just making her do the same thing again, because Agatha was great and Janice is great, and I would like to see more of Dolly Wells doing something like this.
Something interesting I thought was, so her making the email offer to both Mary and to Harry, maybe I'm being a stupid viewer here again, but the idea was to plant strife between them, right? The fact that she gave up the password to Tennant right away, she knew that they would talk about that and she knew that they would seem off to Mary. Am I reading that right? That's how it came across to me, that she was trying to complicate things a bit there. Yeah.
Yeah, she's definitely playing some sort of game.
Mary now thinks that Harry is given, because the contingents that I want to call her Agatha. The contingents that Janice gave Mary was that you have to give him something in return.
So what did Tennant give?
And she feels Mary feels that Tennant has given something up.
And also there's the element of Harry told Mary not to go in the cellar, but of course Mary, by telling her, she gave me the password, she's revealing that she did go in the cellar and talk to the kidnapped woman. So again, it's like more elements of mistrust and sort of things not sowing discord. Yeah.
The putting blood in the cellar was great. I love that. Was a kind of, is she like one of those true crime fans? It was pretty
obsessed.
I mean, it was a good idea, but it was pretty crazy idea. Well, not crazy, was it? It was actually a very smart idea. It was a very sane idea, but it was a very intense idea. But I thought that was pretty cool. Like, she really regained some power.
Was this not something you guys thought of? Maybe this? Maybe I'm the true crime guy that you were talking about. But as soon as she was in the cellar, I thought, now that you're bleeding, put your blood everywhere. That was instantly. I did think that.
Yeah, I think that this is maybe it's something more in the women's toolkit that we've lucky enough to not have thought about or planned about so much. I was quite impressed by her thinking there.
It strikes me that the way we're receiving Janice compared to the other characters is that we're getting her reactions to the situation that Harry and Mary have put her in, but I feel like we're seeing her mostly from Harry and Mary's perspective, if that makes sense. She's sort of like, she's the one who's providing these kind of intimidating responses to her being in prison. And she's going, okay, I've done this and this and this. I'm outplaying you here and here and here. But it feels like maybe, while she's giving all these very genre savvy responses, like, the true crime savvy, she knows to do this and like put her captors in this situation. It feels like it's not necessarily one that requires her to have that much interiority given to her as a character, where when she can just sort of kind of when we can see like Harry and Mary kind of encountering her and having her say some very clever thing, having her do some very clever thing to them, and then we go away again, we're back with Harry and Mary. It feels like the story is sort of weighted towards Harry and Mary's perspective, and Janice becomes almost a bit of a cipher, a bit like how Beth is kind of sort of at the moment she's kind of a vehicle for whatever grief storyline is being. So it sort of feels like Janice is sort of she's distant from us in a way that Harry and Mary aren't. I think would be the most concise way of putting it. Do you guys see what I'm talking about? Do you think I'm...
Yeah.
I have a feeling that there are only 2 episodes left. I was going to say in the long run, but there's not much left. I have a feeling that over the course of the next couple of episodes, there is, given that this is Stephen Moffat, there is something significantly more to Janice, and something more will be done. That she'll have a Welcome to England, Count Dracula moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. Looking forward to that. Yeah, that'll be good.
There were a lot, we talked about him a bit. There were a lot of, I was writing down all the memorable, or the memeable as well, lines in the episode, because there were a lot of Moffat-y lines. We've talked about a lot of them. One we haven't was, everything makes sense if you think about it long enough. Everyone is a murderer, you just have to meet the right person. What's the point of being clever if you can't be lazy? It was personal, it was murder. How much more personal can you get? Grief in particular had a lot of these.
Yeah.
Here's my clever little line about murder kind of stuff. But one I really liked from Janice that we're talking about was I always think things through really thoroughly. It's what you do when you're alone. You think everything through all the way to the end, every possibility, the worst thing that could ever happen. Which wasn't just setting up her doing the bloodletting stuff, but I thought it was a nice little characterization of, she's a lonely kind of, teacher, intellectual type woman. Sounds like she probably lives alone, all that kind of thing. I thought that was good characterization. That was a good little sequence, that what she was saying there.
Yeah, I'm impressed we haven't had an X is just Y for Z one yet, given Moffat's a lot of
So, we mentioned Heaven Sent earlier, and we're living the same day over and over and over again in the same tiny room until someone has the common decency to switch us off between Grief and Dylan. Did you guys like Dylan?
I like Dylan, yeah. And actually, I'll tell you the reason that I like Dylan, what sold me on Dylan, was that scene that I told you about where I was so bored of Tucci's moralising to Beth, and it went on for about 10 minutes. At the end of that scene, Dylan says, his line is something like, all I could think was, boring, moral worth, boring, atonement. And this obviously is Moffat feeling a bit self-conscious about the long scene, the long dialogue that he's just written about moral worth and atonement, and playing into that for viewers like me that actually were bored by it.
What do you think of Dylan, Guy?
I think some of the ways in which Dylan is used as a recurring gag is that Jefferson will allude to some other horrific thing Dylan did that's like sort of almost cartoonishly horrific in a way. You don't want him to like you. He used nurse's ribs as a blooming one of those things. Like what's the next outlandishly horrible act of graphic violence we can say Dylan did? And as much as that's sort of mildly amusing, it's something about Dylan and the way in which he's kind of a little bit cartoon-like, like the whole way through, rather than that much of a person. It's just it's bugging me a little bit. He feels like he's there to be like a grief sidekick in his own way. But I feel like
Oh, really? That's actually what I like about the character.
Yeah, I mean, he's a breath of fresh air. He's comic relief. It's fun. I just feel like I'd be enjoying his presence more if there was maybe a bit more to him. I just feel like Moffat's sort of like, okay, here's the dude who's there and is like just supplementing events.
He's a bit of a Nardole, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a bit of a Nardole. That's a very good way of putting it.
Another line I liked from Janice was, it's always strangely disgusting, isn't it, when someone's so keen to be trusted? And then Mary had an interesting little about porn, of course, because that's Moffat. The internet, it's all just sex. We're crazy about each other. It's non-stop action. No wonder this planet keeps spinning. I looked up execution methods. I got bonded to dungeons. What do you think of that whole Mary dialogue there?
You know, that felt like something Russell T Davies would write almost, when he just has a character go off on almost a rant about like the state of like the internet, or like how people are like engaging with porn or whatever. That felt like a Davies moment. It's very, 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 very odd for Moffat. It was interesting kind of sort of heightened commentary moment, like soapbox moment.
Beware the tricksters and the clowns.
But it's remind me of that Screwdriver Cucumber short. That's just all about a character monologuing about porn. It kind of rang a bit untrue to me, because like the internet's got loads of death and gore and awful stuff like that on it. It's got way too much on it. Like I wish there was less of it there. There's stuff I wish I hadn't seen. So like. Yeah, there's lots of sex on the internet, but it rings off to me that, someone searching around for all this kind of gory stuff wouldn't actually find any of it, because I think you would find more than you'd like to, would be my expectation. But maybe this is Moffat, uses the internet in his way, or maybe Mary uses
Moffat
the internet
forgot to turn off safe search on Google. Although that would filter out porn as well, so yeah, it doesn't really work.
I feel like, Russell is a bit more realistic when he talks about stuff on the internet. He talks about porn in a more Moffat talks about porn usually in a playful way, apart from this story, of course, whereas Russell has a much more encompassing kind of way he talks about it.
There's something almost...
Yeah.
The way Moffat characterizes porn in that little speech, so she says, we're crazy about each other. No wonder the planet keeps spinning. He characterizes porn almost as something, almost beatifically, as this, like, this force of nature. Oh, it's just our natural sexual passions. That's so lovely. Whereas, with RTD, it's like, this is the devil. It's a complete night and day approach.
I don't know if I want to get into this, but, they're different men in a lot of ways. I wonder how much that speaks to their like Moffat is the heterosexual family man. Russell T Davies is the now sadly a widower gay man. Like they've got very different lives in some ways. As close and it's similar in a lot of ways as they are. I wonder. Yeah, they get very different experiences of porn, I guess. Some other lines I thought were interesting were lies are the loudest. That's more, on that kind of note. We said this one earlier, murders are rarely an expression of indifference. Everyone's a murderer, Beth. All it takes is a good reason and a bad day. If you truly love someone, never ever come home early. What did you guys think of that one?
Remind me who said that?
That was Grief saying that to Beth.
See, that one was kind of interesting, because even on both watches of the story, sort of getting that line, I was kind of wondering, like, what exactly is that getting at? Is he saying that, like, coming home early might, annoy them? Is it just a gag about how your spouse might kill you if you, like, do the wrong thing?
It's his wife. It's his wife. That's why he killed his wife, isn't it? His wife cheated or something. There was something going on. He came home early and he killed his wife over.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Of course, you come home early, you see them doing something they don't want you to see, and that's when okay. See, that clicked for me in a way that wasn't completely obvious when I actually watched the show. Yeah. So see, I was the stupid viewer in that case.
No, there's so many. Like I know this is happening to plenty of people. There, someone comes home early because that something wrong when at work, something happened at work, or the traffic screwed up, or they forgot something, whatever reason. You come home early. You catch your partner, who totally thought you weren't going to be there. And it's not always necessarily cheating, but you might be walking in on a time they didn't want you in and they weren't expecting you in. And so there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong there. So yeah, that was interesting.
I think the idea of loving someone so strongly that it makes you kill them, it's like that. There's a lot of sort of maybe horror fiction that kind of revolves around that idea of someone who's like a stalker obsessed, kind of a murderous form of love for a person. So it's interesting for Moff to kind of normalize that in a way that say that maybe we're all capable of that kind of like dangerous love in a way.
Yeah. I was just thinking of Tennant at the end being like, I've saved this family. Ben won't be destroyed. You won't kill a woman in our cellar. I thought that was also interesting, those lines, that I've saved this family.
He's very Walter White, isn't he? There are various ways in which he reminds me of Walter. I suppose it is the same sort of genre, isn't it? It's the same sort of style of idea. Yeah. What if nice good man goes bad? So, but yeah, there are a few Walter White analogues here.
It's, yeah, I mean, Mary's not saying it, but you can see someone has to save this family from the man who saves this family. Yeah.
Speaking of that last scene, what do you guys think of how it was directed? Because that scene was directed in a very...
The spinning camera?
Yeah, it was directed in a very self-announcing kind of way, that whole sequence. Like, I think certainly more so than I think maybe anything else in the show so far. Like, what did you guys think of that? And also just, I guess, the director in general?
My favorite little flourish were the like white transitions, you know, like connecting one location to the other location, or like we had, you know, going through the house's floors, or, you know, we start off with America stuff on the left and we pan and we kind of shifts into the stuff on the right. I liked those. That was a little visual thing I liked.
I liked that final shot in episode 1 of Tucci in his cell and Dolly Wells in her cell. That one stuck with me, yeah.
Yeah. There were loads of like face directly to camera shots as well in both episodes.
Oh, yeah. I remember now. That was the vicar and his wife, wasn't it, looking at the door, but that's us, isn't it? Looking at the camera.
Yeah.
Talking about maybe...
What did you think of the direction gig?
Well, the reason I brought up the ending of episode 2 is because I felt that whole sequence where I guess Harry was justifying himself to Mary about taking the rap for being a paedophile and stuff, and that was intercut with Edgar's mother slowly walking up the stairs about to find... Oh, just while I'm on that note, when Edgar's mother was walking up the stairs, did you guys figure that Edgar would have killed himself before we actually saw it? Yeah. I think it's kind of obvious. The moment we see her walking up the stairs, we don't know where Edgar is. Okay, he's killed himself. So I felt that the way that was then dragged out in a really long way, you go back and forth between her and Harry, and we're swirling all the way around, in this really, really quite sort of operatic manner, really openly cinematic manner, and all of this is building up to the suicide note reveal, which is essentially this really nasty, just sort of writerly contrivance of a twist, just to say like, ha ha, basically essentially a writer prank on the characters. I felt that was the first moment where I felt that...
Yeah, a lot of this is self-aggrandizing writer stuff.
Yeah, I felt almost that was a moment where maybe the style of the show and the direction is maybe cutting against the script in some way. Not, I wouldn't say this is a recurring problem, but just in that sequence, I felt that the materials were being handled in this really operatic, really sort of almost lush way, whereas what was actually being written here and portrayed is something that's a lot spikier and sort of more twisted and sort of raggedy and filthy almost. So rather than the beauty of that color grading, that lighting, the sweeping camera movements, phasing through walls. Do you see what I mean? I felt there was something lush about how that whole thing was treated. Whereas I think the material is maybe not as highbrow, perhaps, as it was the style was suggesting.
Do you think the scene in the church with the blaring music and Tennant trying to manipulate Edgar, do you think the style there was intentionally meant to be like ironic, cutting against, you know, the kind of what Tennant was trying to do there? Or do you think that was a misjudgment, the way you think the ending of episode 2 was?
See, that's where it gets thorny, because I said earlier, I mean, I love how that music was playing into that scene. I think making it, I'd rather not try and get into the question of intent there, because I love how it worked. I don't know if it was like really like, oh, we're actually taking seriously Harry's religious stuff here. But I feel it hard to believe it could be, because it's just so nakedly self-serving, because we keep seeing the phone and stuff. But I just loved how it played out there, because it felt like the emotional sort of trumpeting of it was being undermined by the actual like reality of like Harry's kind of hypocritical, kind of lying, deceptive motives and all of that, and the way that Harry was basically trying to put Edgar in the frame despite trying to supposedly give Edgar salvation. I loved just exposing the hypocrisy of all of that while trumpeting the sort of religious ecstasy of the music and stuff. So I love that, but it felt slightly different. It felt slightly different in the ending of episode 2, I think particularly because yeah, I'm not even sure about my own opinions anymore. I think it certainly in that last scene, Harry is making himself out to be like the Christ figure, the one who has sacrificed himself to save the family or whatever. And definitely the bullshit of that is, I guess, being played up by the style in that sense. But maybe my problem is more just that the scene was really like long and like sort of like sluggish.
They weren't specifically talking about the direction, but I did listen to an interview where Dolly Wells and Moffat were talking about how a big part of the show is that the audience is part of like the joke. Like the audience is part of like the jokes of, you know, the dark jokes of the show. They're like kind of in on it with the characters, you know, about what's ironic or what's funny about this. And Moff has also said that he thinks life is like funny and inappropriate. He thinks life is more like a sitcom than a drama, because in dramas people remember to be sad all the time, whereas in real life, you know, everything's always awkward and inappropriate, and you know, there's you know, you're itchy during like your lover breaking up with you, or you need to go to the bathroom during, you know, someone getting murdered, and you know, like in real life, stuff is funny or like cuts against the seriousness of situations. So he feels like the you know, having the inappropriate and kind of jarring stuff in that, or having things be more sitcom-y is more true to life.
There's enough humour all being taken, because I find, I don't know if it's since having children or something, I can't really bear just totally bleak. Even if I can understand the reason that happened to that person, I started to find it harder to watch things where it's just like, oh, I really can't bear that you're going through this. Whereas in Inside Man, you're part of the joke. I mean, not a joke, but the sort of sick jokes that arrive at times of just like, how have we got into this situation? And this is, if it weren't so terrible, it would be funny, and therefore it's still a bit funny, and you feel confused for funny. But means you can keep handling it, because you know, you have such little.
So my theory is always that life is far more like a sitcom than it is like a drama. I mean, in drama, people remember to be serious all the time.
Yeah.
And if they're sad, it's conveniently enough raining, and you know, it's far too consistently in the same mood. In real life, everything's inappropriate. Yeah. Everything's wrong. You're saying goodbye to the love of your life, and you're never going to see them again. But you're desperate to go to the loo, so you wish they'd hurry up. You know, I mean, there's you know that. Do you know what I mean? The comedy is what our lives are like: inappropriate, badly timed, in poor taste. Yeah. With lots of low humour. That's what our lives are like. And that's what I think at the beginning of Inside Man, we first meet Harry and Mary and Ben, that it's a sitcom about a vicarage that just takes a slightly dodgy turn.
So I get, certainly Moffat wants you to be in on the joke with all this stuff. Yeah. But I wonder about the aesthetics of the show, whether they do as well.
I think in particular in the case of Edgar's suicide, the text and the source material is dark and horrifying and sort of darkly funny enough that I think they could play up the dark humour of that almost a bit more. I felt in the church scene, the presentation was enhancing the dark humour, I felt. But like when it came to Edgar's suicide, I felt that it was somehow strangely undercutting it. I don't know. I mean, I could completely change my opinion on this after episode 4 of Ed. I'm not sure. It's all just sort of thoughts floating around.
It's some stuff, Tyler, I think you'll probably agree with this, because I know you're like me with episodes of stuff like this, that like the show really feels like it's cut in 4, I guess, or cut in 2 to me, rather than being something like Mad Men or The Crown or whatever, where like episodes are really their own individual short stories that we can like completely holistically judge, just as, you know, they all wrap themselves up with their own themes. This feels much more like there's a few things where I'm like, I don't know if I want to judge tonally how it's handling it yet, because I'm not sure. Because it really is. Yeah. This feels to me like one story just chopped into quadrants, more than even like The Time Traveler's Wife, which not as much as some other shows, but was sort of episodes had their own little focuses, you know, rather than just being kind of chopped up semi-arbitrarily. TV works both ways, but it makes me hesitant to judge some stuff, I guess. It's too early to judge, basically.
A lot of our judgments in our discussion have been let's shelve that, haven't they? We've kind of briefly touched on things and said, okay, well, maybe we'll come back to this. Or certainly I have. I've thought a few times. I'll bring something up, but maybe I'll come back to it if there's something that needs bringing up. Like I said about the Dolly Wells character being a bit more to her, and we've said about the wife, and so I think there are some groundworks that have been laid, but we can't really go too far into yet. Which is just, you know, that's just the nature of TV sometimes, isn't it? So it's not like a complaint, but that's just how it is.
there does seem to be more divided into 2 than into 4, because I feel like at the end of episode 2 there's almost like a big break, like status quo shift in the way that there wasn't at the end of episode 1. I think the airing schedule reflects that. You have these first 2 episodes back to back, and the next 2 episodes will be next week back to back as well. So that sort of, I feel like we've entered act 2 of the story now that Edgar's killed himself and Harry sort of put himself in the pedo frame. So yeah, it's sort of an interesting structure in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like 2 2-hour stories, isn't it? 2 2-hour films.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 Sherlock episodes.
Yeah.
Tennant phrased something on the structure on the show quite well. He said, "These 2 very distinct storylines are both entirely plausible, textured, and fascinating in themselves, and they are running side by side. It's very difficult, I think, to immediately imagine how they will ever come together on different sides of the world for these characters living entirely separate existences. They couldn't seem to be more different, yet as an audience, we assume there must be some link, but really we're quite far into the story before those links start to appear. It's part of the setup of the sort of puzzle of that, along with the almost breathtaking awfulness of what occurs, the incremental steps to doom that Harry takes, the unraveling of normality. Stephen described it as a sitcom that goes terribly wrong." And their Tennant is saying, what I really found is like a lot of the novelty of the show is this stuff isn't connected yet, but it's in the same show. I wonder how this is, going to connect eventually.
Okay, I was going to say, I read that Tennant quote before the show, and what struck me is that in episode 2, actually the links are kind of made obvious earlier than I might have liked, because I felt like when Beth was in that motor shop or whatever, and the guy was like, "Hey, Skype call at 9 p.m. and then we see him going on Janice's Facebook page, and it's made very explicit that Grief is investigating Janice, and he is going to get involved in the whole Janice thing. And then episode 2 ends with him saying, "Okay, get on the plane back to England so you can go and get involved with the Janice plot again." It's like, okay, well, we're not even halfway through the story, and you're already making the links pretty clear. Like, I mean, obviously, I don't know how exactly it's all going to go down, but the shape of it seems to be sort of clear-ish. Like, Beth's going to go back to England and maybe somehow do something with that Skype call, and eventually, it will all connect together, especially because we know that Grief has this network of helpers, like, all over the damn place, that will do, like, all kinds of things for him, for whatever reason, almost like Sherlock's blooming associates. So it's like, yeah, it's maybe not, it doesn't feel quite that mysterious yet, how it's all going to tie together. It doesn't feel very puzzly for all that it's marketed as a puzzle box.
But I just wondered, Gig, whether you agree that the wallpaper in the Vicar's house is the same as the Baker Street wallpaper, or at least very similar. That's intentional.
I'm going to be honest, it's been so long since I've rewatched any Sherlock episodes, I could not give you an accurate estimate on that. So
it's worth having a look and getting back to us on that one, because I fully believe that there's a little bit of a nod to Sherlock in that. I think it's the same wallpaper. Do have a look. The other one that I was going to say is just that the opening credits accidentally look a bit like the coupling opening credits. And,
They do.
Yeah, and yeah, that's all I've got to say. Really, it's ultimately I'm not overly impressed with these last couple of episodes, and I've left feeling a little bit. Well, I don't know. It's too early to judge. Do you feel that this is Moff opening up a new IP that might, that might span a few seasons in the future? Well, I kind of do. I think that this is something that can reasonably be done. I think Tucci's, he's a major actor, but he's reasonable to acquire for a few episodes. Do you not see? My feeling is that I can see Beth being the instigator of a case. I can see Tucci being the Sherlock Holmes, and the Tennant thing is just this one, and there will be various other cases throughout. And I can see him, every few years coming back to this kind of thing.
Well, I think the thing is, much like Tennant in lots of things, Tennant and Tucci are only really in the show because the lockdown trapped him in, certain places in England. They both said they probably weren't going to get cast, or they weren't able to be being in the show without lockdown trapping everyone down, is the case of how Tennant and Tucci got on the show, apparently. So there's that aspect of, I don't know how gettable he would be. But then again, Tucci is actually friends with Moffat. Him and his partner are friends with Moffat and his wife, and they like each other.
I get
lot,
the feeling
apparently. So
that he enjoyed doing this.
yeah, I do too.
And I get the feeling that Moffat enjoyed doing this too. And it seems to me like he's opening up his own Sherlock Holmes, isn't he? He's doing his own the Moffat original version of the Super Detective.
I don't know if Moffat could necessarily like feel that there's more to do with these specific characters, but like I think plausibly, I don't think it's entirely out of the question that in the future Moffat could view sort of quote unquote Inside Man as a kind of anthology thing, where you have a similar, maybe a spiritual sequel in some way, follow up under the same name or something like that. I mean, I can't predict the future. I don't know. I don't know how the story's going to end. I mean, maybe Grief gets executed at the end of this one. Like that would kind of preclude further appearances. But you know,
it's Moffat might need an IP on his hands because he's had a couple of humiliations this year. He's had a show get cancelled with Time Traveler's Wife, and I don't know how this show is going to do success-wise. Not that it matters, I guess. Because
to be fair, his theatre show is coming to London West End.
It's done very
play's
well.
been a bright success.
Yeah, no, I can see this being left a bit open and maybe toyed with in the future.
Well, he's got a lot of things he could come back to. Like, there's a Press Gang follow-up he nearly did around 2010 before he got too busy with Doctor Who, but that was about to start to actually happen way back in the day. I would like him maybe to go back to that one day. That could be interesting. Dracula, I remember when it came out, him and Gatiss were saying, well, yeah, you know, Dracula dies, but never really dies. So I feel like if they ever wanted to, they could do more of that.
Nah, I doubt that with Dracula.
There's the big one that I assume will happen eventually one day when Martin Freeman might feel a little chirpier, or, you know, everyone's a little more free maybe when they're older. I assume that'll happen one day. Because you laugh, but, you know, Luther did get a movie in the end. You know, these things do actually happen if you give them enough time.
No, I do. I've expressed my opinion before that I think Sherlock will become every 5 years or so, and it will go into even old age. I think that you'll see the old adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Similar to the Ian McKellen thing that recently came out. Sherlock's old cases or whatever. Yeah.
Failing that, there's always Jekyll the Return.
Yeah, the one that what's his name is always banging on at him about. James Nesbitt.
Really? Moffat's getting all these men banging at his door. I know Robert Bathurst wanted to do those new bits of footage for Joking Apart, those vlog things. Yeah, he's got all these guys that want to do more besides Benedict and Martin, I guess.
Yeah. But maybe Stanley Tucci.
Yeah, we got to see the show end before we can decide if we want more, let alone can there be more. But yeah, it's an interesting idea to think of Moffat starting an IP because he's, like he says, he's the serial adapter, isn't he? He's the one who adapts other people's IPs. Has he really made anything himself? I guess coupling in Press Gang, I went for a good few years. They were successes. Yeah, we'll see. Well, he's kind of in that. He's like exec producing shows now, like The Devil's Hour. He hasn't written any of that, but people think he does because his name's in the trailer. He's at that like Peter Jackson stage now where he can put his name on things and people will get confused and they'll watch it because his name was in the thing. So maybe he's entering that stage of his career where he produces stuff. Who knows? And
just maybe for all those actors who are banging on his door, Moffat is their inside man to get back into the TV industry.
Well said. Yeah,
that's a wrap.
Yeah, and that does it for our first conversation on Inside Man, our discussion on the first half of the show. Thanks to those listening. Please share your thoughts on the show, your thoughts on what might happen next in the show, your thoughts on our thoughts about the show. Anything you've got. We always love to read and engage with what others have to say. And yeah, thanks again.